in my profession, theater, it's very important that we start with awareness of stillness and the movement and stillness. Theater is about one thing, about a continuous line. There are no stops. It's only go. But you have to be aware of the sounds and silence and the movement and stillness.
Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's episode is part of our collaboration with NYU Skirball, the Downtown Performance Series, spotlighting the directors, performers, and artists who transformed experimental theater and performance in New York and beyond. In this episode, we're honored to share a conversation with Robert Wilson, the visionary director whose epic stage works fused light, movement, and sound into unforgettable images. Beginning in the late 1960s, Wilson revolutionized the language of performance. His collaborations were as expansive as his imagination. Philip Glass, Tom Waits, Lady Gaga, Willem Dafoe, Jessye Norman, and many others. Einstein on the Beach remains a landmark in modern opera, but Wilson's influence spans decades of theater, opera, and performance worldwide. Recorded just 3 months before his death, this interview offers a rare and intimate window into the mind of an artist who is still creating, still innovating, and still asking questions up until the very end.
I grew up in Central Texas. I didn't have a chance to go to art museums because there were none. Very little chance to go to the theater. It was a community of religious fanatics, very strict Southern Baptists, radicals, right-wing. You couldn't walk down the street with a black man or a black person. It was highly segregated. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday in junior high school, if you'd seen someone sinning, someone going to a theater, if you'd seen a woman wearing pants, if you'd seen someone social dancing, you could write their name on a little piece of paper and put them in a box. And 2 o'clock Friday afternoon, we had to pray for those names in the prayer box. I saw you going to a theater, and I'm going to put your name on a piece of paper, and on Friday, we're going to pray for you. I saw you a woman wearing pants. I'm going to put her name on the prayer box, and we'll pray for her too. So this is the community where I grew up. When I was 17, I went to the University of Texas. I was excited to be with people from other cultures, different color of skin, different beliefs than mine and what I'd grown up knowing. And I knew quite early on that I was visually oriented, and I was interested in painting. And then I came to New York, and I said I would study architecture mostly to please my father, and because I still was thinking about studying painting, but I knew that my father wouldn't think it was a serious profession. So I told him I would like to study architecture, and he said with his Texan accent, "Son, to study architecture's not serious. You have to study engineering." But I did study architecture. Byrd Hoffman, when I met her, I stuttered, and she said to me, I was barely 17, she said, "Take more time to speak. Slow your speech down." And I went home and did, and it was almost as if I was speeding in place. And within 6 weeks, I'd pretty much overcome the stuttering. So it was a physical thing. And years later, in 1967, when I established the foundation, I named it Byrd Hoffman, after this woman who taught dance, ballet to the children in Waco. At that time, I was a waiter in an Italian restaurant. I was a dishwasher. I was working with children with learning difficulties, hyperactive, brain damage, quote, children. I was working at Goldwater Memorial Hospital with people in iron lungs. They were mostly catatonic. I was working in Harlem with preschool children, Bedford-Stuyvesant with preschool children. I was working in Short Hills, New Jersey with children from wealthy families, DuPont families, etc. And I decided to start a foundation. But she had a deep belief that the human body could heal itself. Believed that through physical activity would be easier to learn. And later I worked with a woman who believed pretty much the same thing, that physical activity is related to mental activity. And that often when a child is having difficulty to learn to speak, learning to tie shoes, learning to add, to open a door, to repeat a rhythm, that it's a lack of physical activity that hinders learning. And the woman I worked with, and after Byrd Hoffman, studied movements of babies and the movement of infants. Very simple things. Move your fingers. Look at your fingers moving. Move your toes. Look at your fingers and your toes moving. And the most sophisticated movement was crawling. And she went back and exercised young people, children, in these primary stages of physical activity. And it was amazing that often the child who was having difficulty learning to tie shoes, add numbers, or learning to speak, learning to walk, that it became easier for them to learn by going back and exercising in movements that they had missed as babies, living in playpens, living in crowded conditions where their physical activity had been limited. I start silently with movement. Some anthropologists believe that man was moving before he was speaking. And from movement came sounds, and sounds connected to higher vibrations of mental activity, and words were eventually formed. Outward expression is a result of inward feeling. Drama 101, start to stand. Learn to stand on a stage. Wow, how many schools do we know where you start with learning to stand? You learn to stand by standing. You learn to walk by walking. And there are hundreds of ways of walking. You don't learn to walk by reading a book. You learn to walk by falling down. You learn to walk by doing it. Learning is doing. So we learn by doing. And the mind is a muscle. And it's not just in the head, but it's in the doing. Look at animals. Look at polar bears. I used to watch a polar bear at the Bronx Zoo go the end of a big rock and swing that big body around and walk in figure eights. But it's in that he knew what he knew was in the body. The mind is a muscle. So my early works were all silent, and they were based on movement. And Martha Graham said, as a choreographer, there's no such thing as no movement. There's always movement. And sometimes when we're very still, we become more aware of movement than when we make a lot of movement. But as long as we're living, we're moving, we're breathing. And if we become aware of that movement and stillness, when we move outwardly, the line will continue. But if we're not aware of the inner movement and stillness, and you start to move, the line is broken. I'll tell you a beautiful story on Jessye. So this was a few days after 9/11, and I had staged with Jessye in Paris, Winterreise, Schubert, and we were scheduled for a month to do a number of performances each week. And it was 3 days after 9/11, and we had opened. We had a big success. The theater was sold out for the month. And she called me in the morning. She said, I can't sing tonight. And I said, oh, why? And she said, I'm so emotional about what has just happened. I will start to cry. And I said, but Jessye, this is the time we must hear your voice. So she called at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and said, okay, I'm going to try. And there are 21 songs in the cycle. And she sang the first 2, and during the third one, she started crying. And she stopped, and after a few minutes, got control of herself. And then she stood for 10 minutes in silence. The audience started crying. What she felt so deep inside of her was as beautiful or more beautiful than when she sang. There are very few people that can do that. I always say in Drama 101, you have to learn to stand on a stage. If I had gone to Yale and studied drama, I would never be doing what I'm doing. You know, I'm doing what I'm doing by living life. I walked down the street and saw a policeman about to hit a black boy over the head with a club. I grabbed the arm of the policeman. I said, why do you hit this boy? He said, none of your business. I said, but it is. I'm a responsible citizen. Why do you hit the boy? And my life took a totally different course of action, because eventually in 1967, as a gay man, I adopted a black boy. Imagine trying even to do it today, but imagine in 67. And my early works were developed with him. As far as I could tell, knew almost no words. As far as we could measure his hearing in decibels, he heard nothing. So up to 110 decibels in the eardrum, he heard nothing. And one evening, he was at one end of my loft and what later became Soho. And it was a space of about 75, 80 feet deep. And he was at one end of the room with his back to me, and I was at the other end of the room. And I cried out to him, Raymond! In a very loud sound. He didn't hear me. I knew if I would stamp my foot on the floor, he'd feel the vibration and turn around. But then I did a very curious thing. Hey man, how are you? in the sound of a deaf person. He started laughing like, hey, man, you're talking my language. So, wow, I started thinking his body was more familiar with those vibrations of sound than the hearing world. So in a sense, his body was hearing. His body was feeling sound. And although technically we described him as being deaf, actually, he was hearing. So the body hears, the body feels. Later on with Raymond, I wrote a play that was 7 hours long and silent. And much to my surprise, we had a tremendous success in Paris. Raymond did a rocking movement on stage in the performance. And one night I said to him, put a sound with the movement. And he did this rocking movement, and he went, ah, ah, this high-pitched sound. It was not the sound of a deaf person. Hey, man, how are you? Where the sound is blocked and locked in the body. Here, the sound was free, free, free in the body. If you would scream, if I would scream, and he screamed, you could not distinguish which was the scream of a deaf person. We started with movement, and from movement came sound. So again, some anthropologists believe that's how language was formed. Well, before meeting Christopher Knowles, who was a young man, boy, in Schenectady, New York, in the Odie Heck School, an institution that was more or less correcting his way of constructing thoughts in mathematics and geometry with words and sounds. You'd go hat up hat hat hat, hat up hat 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 hat, hat up hat hat hat, hat up hat hat, H-A-T, hap, H-A-P, hath, H-A-T-H. H-A-T, ap, A-P, hath, H-A-T-H, hat, hap, ath. This would repeat 4 times. Then a variation of that would repeat 3 times. Then this would come back for 4. It'd go 4, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 4, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1. Which sounded totally arbitrary. And this was being corrected, and when I met him, I said, why are we correcting it? I would encourage him to do more. And so eventually he came to stay with me, and we wrote my first play with text with him. And a couple of weeks after he was with me, he said, dear madam, most gracious of ladies, I'll be in no way possessed of an honor of an introduction, indeed infinitely removed from the deserving of it, yea, singularly unfit for the exposure of the brilliance of your sun, being in verity of a condition so abject in this destitution of grace, outward or inward, as to make my presence tolerable only to the humblest, abounding in the bounding of tolerance. Went on and on. It was 19th century language. Christopher had never read a book. I said, Chris, what is that? He said, it's a letter for Queen Victoria. I said, where did you get this letter for Queen Victoria in 19th century language? No, I don't know. So I wrote a play with him called A Letter for Queen Victoria. In New York, it was not well received at all. They said, Robert Wilson takes advantage of a brain-damaged child and puts him on stage. You're damn right I did. It was barbaric to me that he was being institutionalized. Later, when I became more aware of what Gertrude Stein, there was a definitely parallel to what Stein was doing I did her Four Saints and Three Acts, first at the Houston Grand Opera and later here in New York and elsewhere. And the New York Times said that Gertrude Stein's text was just nonsense. Yes, it was just nonsense. Divine nonsense. But Chris wrote texts of nonsense. And my early works were plays of nonsense. Well, in the case with Christopher, I learned his language. I learned to say hadapat, and we could speak it together. We still can. But it came to a point with Christopher, once I entered his kingdom, the language no longer interested him. He would change his codes. I did a letter for Queen Victoria. We had something like a vaudeville routine, and it was in between acts. And we would cross the stage while they were changing the scenery, and I'd say, "And you sit on the bench." And he says, "And you wait for me." And I said, "And you sit on the bench." And he says, "And you wait for me." We had various dialogues like that. And one night I said, "And you sit on the bench." And he went, "Explico books." I said, "And you sit on the bench?" Explico books. And I said, "And you sit on the bench?" Explico books. We left the stage, and I said off stage, I said, "Christopher, what is this Explico books?" He started laughing. And from that moment, and for the next 2.5 weeks, he spoke this strange language. He could type it on a typewriter, he would speak it. And there's a friend of ours, her name was Marie-Claude Dane. She was the director of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. And she was totally fascinated by Christopher and his mind and the way he saw the world, the way he spoke, the way he formed his thoughts. And she called me about 3 or 4 in the morning. She said, "I've discovered what he's doing. Explico books is, and you wait for me." He took the alphabet, which has 26 letters, and went 13 letters off. Everything is 13 letters removed. And he was speaking that language. So the next morning I said, "Aha, Christopher. So Explico books is," and from that day to this day, that was years ago, he never spoke the language again. That I had entered his kingdom, and it was no longer fascinating for him. So Chris looked at language in a very free way, like molecules that combine and combust. And he would say, second night he was with me, he said, "I'm the red secondary planned a pest, jet madness in the sky. I remember all my life." So he took words, a pest or something, he would always tweak them. He was never afraid to break his codes. So I said, if I would say, "Hello, how are you? Hello, 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 how are you?" After "hello, how are you? Hello, how are you?" My code is discernible, becomes understandable in a sense by repetition. And once that becomes discernible, I can break the code, and with the decomposed parts, I can reconstruct a new language. Often that's what artists do. We call it theme and variation. That's what Mozart does. That's what choreographers do. But you start a theme, and once it reaches a certain point, you can change it, alter it, and then with these decomposed parts, you form another language, and then you can make a time-space construction. A lot of that I learned also from Chris. Chris Knowles could readily see big pictures. I always think it's like the human body. So my body has skin, but beneath the skin is meat, and in the meat is a bone. So the skin is what resonates, which attracts us, but it's what's beneath the skin that makes the surface attractive and mysterious. To me, it's always the space behind the words that gives the surface a resonance that makes them important. I did once a piece called The Black Rider with William Burroughs and Tom Waits. Burroughs would say, "That's how the cookie crumbles. That's how the potato mashes." It's the irony behind the words. So a rose is not a rose. It's the space behind the words. Tom Waits, wrote an opening number, "Come along with the Black Rider," says the devil. We're gonna have a gay old time. I'm gonna drink your blood like wine. It's the irony behind those words. Take off your skin and dance around in your bones. We're gonna have a gay old time. Often in directing work or something, I think about it that way, that skin, meat, and bones. Time and space is a way of constructing all works. And there are only two lines in the world. To me, time is the line that goes to the center of the earth and goes to the heavens. And space is a horizontal line. And it's this cross of time and space. It's the basic construction in all architecture. It's the drip of milk in the Vermeer painting. It's that black stripe down Barnett Newman's painting. It's how you stand on a stage. This is open. And you're standing here. This is the heavens. That's the center of the earth. The Japanese believe that the gods are beneath that floor. Classical architecture is buildings and trees. So a building looks like this, but you put a tree in front, right? The tree helps you see the building helps you see the tree. That's classical Greek theater, protagonist, antagonist, a chorus. You have classical ballet, a prima ballerina, and a corps de ballet. Builds a building. And we all live in this mega structure. But we're free in our apartments to design them the way we want. Paris is a beautiful city because it has a beautiful plan for a city. So Frank Gehry or contemporary architects can build a building, you can build your own home, but there's an overall plan to the megastructure. So the megastructure gives us freedom. So in my plays, I have very strict form, but within the form, people can express themselves the way they want. The more mechanical we become, the freer we become. So that's another opposite. I mean, we were looking at Allegra Kent in Balanchine's ballet. She had rehearsed it so many times that it became automatic, and that's the freedom. If I do that gesture and I want to repeat it, it takes many hours of observing what I did, where did I start, where did I go, and how do I end, for me to have the freedom to repeat it again. Charlie Chaplin made 375 takes of a scene because the first time he did it had a freedom. For him to gain freedom again, he had to go over and over and over and over those movements until they were free. Well, Philip and I are more or less from the same generation. He's a little bit older than I am, but we think alike. And when I first met him, he came to see this 12-hour play, the opera. I call it a silent opera. The play went from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. And he came backstage and we went and had breakfast in Lower Manhattan. And I asked him how he wrote music, and he wrote some structures of how he structured his work. And I said, wow, it looks very similar to the way I structure a play. So we shared something in common with the choreographer Lucinda Childs, the same thing. Whether it's a generation or what, but we share a common sense of time. People said, Einstein on the Beach, the opera made with Philip Glass was avant-garde. It was not avant-garde, actually. It was very classical, traditional. It was in 4 acts with themes A, B, and C, like this. This is 5-hour opera. So it's A and B, C and A, B and C, A, B, C together in the 4th act. That's called theme and variation. There's nothing really new about it. It didn't follow a narrative, but it was a classical form. I had in the 1st act, 1A, I have a train moving across a field. So it's seen from your perspective. But Einstein said if you see a train from above, you see a line. So I had in 1A a train moving across the stage, and then it was interrupted by a vertical line. It comes back for 2A. The theme of the train, so the first time we saw the train was at midday, and now we saw a train at night, so it was a different time, different perspective. And I looked out the window of my apartment, that time it's 67 Vestry Street, and there was a building in the other side of the Hudson and in New York. And that building was the same form or shape that we had last seen the train at night from the back. It had occupied the same kind of vertical space. When the A theme came back in the 4th act, it was a building, but it occupied spatially the same perspective as I'd seen the train from the back going into the distance. I was thinking about the number 3 in Einstein, so he had ABC. I thought about the 3 ways in which painters have measured space traditionally. If I see my hand here, I can say it's a portrait. If I look at it over here, I can say it's a part of a still life. But if I go across the street and look at it, it's a part of a landscape. So you have portraits, still lifes, and landscapes as 3 ways of measuring space traditionally by painters. I thought again, skin, meat, and bones. I was constantly referring to the number 3. Music was the numerical counts of the music. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those were the numerical counts of the score, or the solfege of the music. Do, so, fa, do, so, fa, do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do, so, fa, do, re, mi, do, re, mi. They were singing the solfege of the score. You can't try to make sense out of it, you know. It has to be, it's like Gertrude Stein, you know, if he hears a rose is a rose is a rose, it's not. But if you try to make sense out of it, it doesn't work. I think about a work abstractly. I think abstractly. So even if I'm directing Hamlet or whatever, I first conceive it more mathematically and some sort of formula that I can quickly see or grasp. And math, we can code our thoughts more readily. My father was a religious man, so he believed in giving money to the church. I'm not a religious person. I think religion divides man. I think politics divide man. I think art and culture have the possibility to unite us, to bring together man. One of the few things that remain throughout time is what artists do. If we go back 5,000 years ago, we look at artifacts, the work of artists. We don't think necessarily about the wars that were going on at that time. But we look at work of artists. Artists are the diaries and journals of our time. So in 1967, I was about 27, I started a foundation based on 4 principles. We must always look to the past as we go forward. We must always support our community, but to make our community great, we support the global community. So we have here in this room, I have a Chinese Neolithic piece of pottery here. That is 3,500 before Christ, so that is 5,000 something years old. I have here notations of Merce Cunningham's Canfield, a new dance work that had a tremendous influence on me. The Merce made in 1965. We, as a laboratory for creative thinking, live with some awareness of what man did in the past as we go forward with new work. If you go in the main building here, the center building, there's no door, there's an opening. So night or day, you can walk in this building any day of the year. There's no door. We have an open door. I'm a dancer, I learned by practice. And so we're always practicing. And Socrates said, the baby is born knowing everything. It's the uncovering of the knowledge that's the learning process. So for me, the uncovering of the knowledge is rediscovering for every generation the classics. And the classics are what remains in culture. If we look at the Chinese, we look at the Mayans, we look at the Egyptians, it's all the same mathematics.
Artifacts is an independent nonprofit platform offering free access to indelible histories. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, and if you're able, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.